Hi guys, and welcome back to Contract Law. This is video 4 in the video series for consideration, and we have looked now at the whys and wherefores, the whos, the whats, and we now finally come to the issue of when. So when does consideration have to move across? Timing is everything, actually. A few things before we kick off our discussion in this video. And they're basically definitional in nature. So what you need to get straight in your head is that an executory consideration is something that has yet to be done. It will happen in the future. So where you hear the phrase executory consideration, you know it hasn't happened yet. Once consideration has actually moved across, the act has been performed, the thing done, the thing refrained from, then it will be executed consideration. Okay, executory, not yet happened. Executed, has already happened. Now, executed consideration has to be kept very clear and very separate from the notion of past consideration. Past consideration is actually no consideration at all. And past consideration is just something that you are offering as consideration in a bargain, but it's something that you've already done. Okay, now that is not going to constitute something of value in the eyes of the law that you are offering to the other party, either as an advantage for them or as a detriment to yourself, because the thing's already been done even before you're doing the offering and accepting and deal making in this particular deal. Now there are some exceptions to that. We'll go through that in just a moment. The other issue is presently existing duties. And that kind of ties into the notion of past consideration, where you've already strapped yourself in to some form of contract to do something. Usually you can't use that as consideration in a fresh deal. That also has its exceptions, and that's why we're looking at the themes in contract to try and pull it all together. So hopefully it makes sense by the end of this video for you. Okay, so let's have a little look at past consideration. Now, as I said, past consideration is no consideration at all. Really no rocket science about this particular principle. Ross Kohler and Thomas, I call it the naughty horsey remorse case. So after the sale of a horse, Ross Kohler says to Thomas, a bit of buyer's remorse here, oh, I really want this undertaking. I need to know that the horse is sound and free of vice. Now, probably something he should have thought about earlier after he bought the horse, but he demands this undertaking that it was sound and free of vice. Obviously, you know, the guy just wants to get rid of him. Says, yes, okay, it's sound, the horse is sound and free of vice. However, the horse was vicious. And so what do you do in that circumstance? Well, obviously, poor old Mr. Ross Kohler sued. It was held, obviously, that there was no consideration for that promise that the horse was sound and free of vice. The horse had been offered for sale, there'd been acceptance, there'd been consideration and whatever, and this, you just had this little promise hanging out in the air after the deal's being done, no consideration there. So, like I said, no real rocket science there. There is one kind of exception that the texts do talk about. And again, it really is just a bit of common sense. So, again, not really rocket science, but if an act or forbearance occurs before the promise at issue, it may well be good consideration if there was a certain timeline of events, okay? If it occurred at the request of the promisor and the parties intended the promisee would be compensated for whatever they're going to do. They then go ahead and do it, and the benefit must have been legally enforceable if it was made beforehand. And then you have the promise to do whatever it is that is said to have been done. A couple of cases just kind of flesh this out. Lampley and Braithwaite, another old case, 1615. A party had killed a man unlawfully and contracted with another party, as you do, to obtain their services to ride to the king and petition for his pardon in this unlawful killing. The person actually does undertake this petitioning of the king and is successful. Yay, he gets off. However, then he doesn't want to pay this person for this service of petitioning the king for a pardon. Now, it was clearly intended by both parties that the petitioner was going to be compensated for their service. They incurred cost and expense in doing what was asked of them. However, it was only afterwards that a promise to pay was made. And then when they reneged on the promise, the court had a little look at whether there was consideration, and they said yes. In this particular circumstance, in this particular timeline of events, there was, an offer and acceptance that occurred, and both parties contemplated at the time that all of this was happening, the contract was being formed, that payment was going to occur, some form of consideration was going to be paid. Okay, now just the fact that the promise came later to confirm the parties' understanding of what was already on foot doesn't really matter, because everything really did all happen at the beginning anyway. Okay, power on is just a bit of a more complicated scenario, but proves the same point. So that brings us to the somewhat tangentially related issue of presently existing duties. So what about the situation where you've already strapped yourself in to do something between the same two parties? Can you use that as consideration for a fresh deal? The general principle there is from Wigan and Edwards, and it says a new promise that's indistinguishable from an old promise, same two parties, same promises to do the same stuff, is an illusory consideration for a fresh agreement between the same two parties. So unless there is no previous entitlement to whatever is given or received as consideration, it is not going to be good or sufficient consideration. I'll say that again. Unless there's no previous entitlement to whatever is said to be the consideration, it's not going to be sufficient. Okay. Now, looking firstly at public duties, presently existing public duties. If you're already bound to do something as a public duty, then generally speaking, you can't use it as consideration in a bargain. Here's the case of Collins and Godefroy. Collins was subpoenaed to give evidence. Now, this is a public duty that you have to do, okay, already strapped into that particular duty. Godefroy promised to pay 6 guineas to Collins for his trouble to give evidence in that case. The question there was whether Collins then going and actually giving the subpoenaed evidence was going to constitute consideration for that 6 guineas. No, it wasn't. Why is that? He already had a duty to do that. He wasn't promising Godefroy anything in particular, anything extra of value in the eyes of the law than what he was already bound to do. So, no consideration. Glassbrook, I think, is probably a little more interesting. Under the conditions of a coal strike, you had obvious turmoil happening around this particular coal mine, this colliery, and the manager thought that it really needed some protection. The police said, nah, it's all right, no problems. We think that our mobile officers will be able to look after you sufficiently well. And the colliery thought, nope, I think we need a belts and braces approach here. They wanted to actually station billet a number of police officers at the colliery to quell the disquiet there. There was a deal that was struck. Payment was to be made for stationing these police officers at the colliery. And later on, when there was a dispute about payment in that particular deal, the colliery was trying to argue, well, hang on a minute, the police were already bound as a matter of public duty to look after us at the colliery. And the court said no. They saw it in the same view that the police saw it. The police thought that it would be perfectly acceptable to protect the colliery by ordinary means with ordinary mobile officers. They didn't see any need to station officers at the colliery. And that was something over and above the public duty of the police to provide protection in those circumstances. So there was good consideration in that case. No real rocket science, just, you know, common sense, I guess. Looking at circumstances where you are already strapped into some form of existing contractual duty to the same promisor. Now, here are some cases that you really need to get your head around, just a few of them, but they show the development of courts' thinking over 1800 and some odd through to the present day. The first is Stilk and Myrick. And in this case, we had Stilk being a seaman on a ship from London to the Baltic and back. In that contract of engagement, Stilk agreed to do all he could as seaman under all emergencies of the voyage. Okay, during that voyage, 2 sailors deserted, and the captain promised the others that if they kept on working the ship back to London, they would split the deserters' wages. The inevitable happened. Stilk agreed, and the captain reneged. Okay, Stilk's claim for that extra payment, the splitting of the deserters' wages, failed. Why is that? Because he had already promised to do exactly what he did on the back half of the journey after the deserters had left, as he did beforehand. He had already agreed to step up in times of emergency and do more work if he had to do so without any extra payment. Okay, so not hard to understand there. When you then look at Hartley and Ponsonby, you can see why there was perhaps a little bit of a different decision in that case. Very similar facts. So Hartley agreed to serve on a ship from Liverpool to Port Phillip and then on to some various other ports. In Port Phillip, 17 out of the 36 crew refused to work and they were sent off to prison. Of the 19 that were left, only 4 to 5 of them were able seamen. Now, this had a fairly serious consequence. It was dangerous, essentially dangerous for life and limb to go back to sea at that point. Now, the master of that ship obviously wanted to get back to sailing and getting on to Bombay. He offered £40 extra wages to the sailors that remained on the ship to work the ship off to Bombay. They agreed, same thing, the master of the ship reneged, and in this case Hartley won. Why is that? Well, particularly because it was a dangerous situation that Hartley found himself in the back half of the journey as compared to the front half of the journey when he originally contracted. Okay, the court kind of have a look at the text on this. The court kind of comes to a bit of an artifice, if you will. What they do is they say, oh yes, there was actually fresh consideration for that back half of the journey in terms of getting the extra money, because the contract had actually been abandoned by virtue of this danger to life and limb that happened with everyone being sent off to prison and there being only 4 to 5 seamen left on the ship. So because the original contract had been abandoned, whatever Hartley arranged with the master in terms of working the ship onto Bombay for the extra money, that was a complete new deal. That was a fresh deal, and agreeing to work on the ship was consideration in return for the money, the increased amount of money. So he wasn't really doing anything more. There was an added element of danger, but it was considered to be fresh contract and fresh consideration. If we then look at Williams and Raffi brothers, now this case, the Raffi case, ruffled some feathers. Let me tell you, an English case that has been followed in Australia, but you can see what's happening, can't you? From Stilk and Myrick, we have quite a strict rule, okay? If you have the same kind of contractual obligation and the same parties, and then one party offering to pay more, it's not going to work, is it? Because the party that was meant to be doing their contractual duties is already just performing those same contractual duties in return for a bit of extra money, no consideration. Hartley's case, you've got the court trying to not bend the rules, but find a solution for the plaintiff there, where there was, okay, he was performing the same duties on the back half of the journey, but in a completely different context. And when you get to Williams and Raffi brothers, you see the court becoming perhaps a little bit more bold so far as what it's prepared to do to the doctrine of consideration. Here we had a defendant that was a building contractor, that was Raffi, agreed to refurbish 27 flats. They subcontracted out the carpentry to Williams. Williams unfortunately underquoted and then found himself in some financial difficulty. Raffi was very keen to induce Williams to continue to perform under his contract. He didn't want to have to engage another carpenter, and he certainly didn't want to run behind time. Why is that? Because if he did, if Raffi ran behind time in his head contract, he would suffer penalties. Okay, so it was certainly in his interests to try and convince Williams to complete on time. What he did, offered to pay him an extra £10,300 to finish. Now, in that circumstance, when Raffi then turns around and says, sorry, not going to actually pay you that extra money, you'd already quoted, we'd already contracted for you to complete this carpentry work, Williams actually won. The court in this circumstance was prepared, as I said, to take the whole doctrine of consideration into a place where some commentators don't really agree it should have gone. The question is, obviously, wasn't he just performing an existing duty? Wasn't Williams already bound to complete that carpentry for the same amount of money? And the court said here that the defendant, Raffi, had real doubts about whether or not Williams could actually finish on time, and what he got for paying that extra money was a practical benefit of completion in return for the extra payment. Okay, Williams was doing the same stuff, but now Raffi had basically assured himself and Williams that the job was going to be done on time, and he had avoided the penalties that were looming over his head if Williams did not finish. Now, again, you might think, oh, isn't that really just bending the rules a little bit? Some commentators certainly do seem to think so. And this whole notion of whether or not something is a practical benefit, is that really a furphy? Because if you think about it, if you strap yourself into a contractual obligation and then it kind of becomes inconvenient and you say, I might not be able to do this, isn't it always going to be of some practical benefit for the other party to say, oh, actually, I'd really like you to perform your contract, here's a bit of extra money? So it's almost like a rule without being a rule. So there was a bit of doubt about whether or not that was going to be applied in Australia. There are some good reasons why it has been applied in Australia. So then we come to the, where are we, Musumichi case. Now this is a New South Wales case, so it hasn't gone up to the High Court. There's not, a complete ironclad guarantee on this, but it certainly seems as though we will be following Williams and Raffi brothers. I'll leave you to discover the facts of the case for yourself. It involved a lease and a reduction in the payment of rent. But Santo, Justice Santo's decision gives us three main arguments that the case law hitherto, before Williams and Raffi brothers, had provided for not enforcing a contract for existing duties as good consideration for a fresh deal. Firstly, it was that this kind of principle protects a promisor from extortion, from someone just saying, oh, this is all too inconvenient, I'm not going to do it unless you pay me more money. Santo basically says, well, don't really need to worry about fiddling about with the doctrine of consideration here. You can find sufficient consideration in a practical benefit because even if the contract is formed, we have this action for economic duress nowadays that will help out in circumstances where there has been this undue pressure to extort extra money. So let's just let the contract go through. Let's not worry about analysis in terms of consideration. Second, the next objection in the case law has been that the promisee suffers no detriment for the purposes of consideration because they're only doing what they've already been bound to do. And Justice Santo says, well, actually, in this particular case and in cases like Williams and Raffi brothers, yes, the promisor actually is getting a sufficient consideration in return for promising more money. Here it's in terms of retaining the lessee and not engaging with all the other rights that they had to enforce against the landlord. And in Williams and Raffi brothers, it was getting the actual carpentry work done on time and avoiding the penalties that were looming over the contractor's head. So that one he also threw out the window. And finally, the objection was that, well, if we go in this direction and we say that a practical benefit will suffice to found consideration for extra payment for somebody doing their existing contractual duty, it really leaves no room at all for application of the principle that was set out in the Stilk and Myrick case. Okay, now that case has been going since the 1600s, so they're saying you're overturning an awful lot of entrenched case law here. However, you know, Justice Santo kind of brushes that off and says, well, in the Stilk and Myrick case, the promise to pay extra money was for exactly what was being performed beforehand, because they'd already promised to do whatever they could in terms of, you know, when there was emergencies that happened. So the promise to pay extra was wholly gratuitous. Here he contrasted it, you know, we've got this practical benefit that's moving across in return for the extra payment. So that's the Musumichi case. As I said, look at the facts for yourself, have a bit of a think about it, work out where you think the case law is headed. The final issue I just want to cover off with you quickly on the end of this video is the issue of third parties. So if it can sometimes be a little bit tricky to allege that your existing contractual duty should be sufficient consideration for a new deal, for example, to pay you extra money. What's the deal where you have an existing contractual duty between party A and B, and then party C enters the scene and says, you know what, to party B, you know what, I will do this for you if you continue to perform your obligations under your contract with party A. That, in terms of that pre-existing contractual duty between A and B, will be good and sufficient consideration in that new deal between B and C. Okay, so in Shadwell and Shadwell, we had a nephew engaged to be married. Shadwell wrote to him and said, I'm glad to hear of your marriage. I'm going to give you £150 a year during my life or until your salary reaches a certain amount. Now, the nephew had already contracted to marry, obviously. Now, that marriage was said to benefit the uncle as it was an object of his interest and near relative and all that kind of stuff. The court also rationalised this as being, you know, some kind of detriment to the plaintiff. Have a look at the text. I'm not really sure that I'm convinced about the fancy footwork that the court does to arrive at this particular conclusion, which was that the existing contractual duty between the nephew and the intended fiancé was sufficient consideration for then that contract between the husband-to-be and the uncle. Okay, in the Hill Equipment case, you had an existing contract between two companies, A and B. One demanded a guarantee from the directors of company B. So the directors gave the guarantee from themselves to company A in order to benefit their company, company B. So effectively what the directors were doing, the directors are C at the end of the line, they wanted to ensure that the contract between A and B went ahead. And in that scenario, when there's later dispute as to whether or not that existing contractual duty between those two companies is sufficient consideration for the later promise or guarantee contract relationship between company A and the directors. Yes, it is. Why is that? Because the directors are getting a benefit in their company being able to contract with company A. Unfortunately, the guarantee was enforceable. So that's it for third parties. And what we'll do is we will leave this video here. We will come back for the final part, I promise, in our videos on consideration very shortly. So thanks for watching, and bye for now, guys.